Hello, and welcome to lesson 26 of this basic biblical Greek course. The time has finally arrived for us to tackle participles together. Why are participles important to learn? Well, as someone once said, it is because Greek is a participle-loving language. Greek loves participles, and there are over 6,000 participles in the Greek New Testament. And so if you want to be good at Greek, then you need to master these parts of speech. So today we are going to begin this journey of learning participles together. We'll start with a definition and some basic characteristics of participles, and then we'll move on to learning the present and aorist participle forms together. After that, I will introduce you to some general translation principles when it comes to participles, and then we'll finish with some vocab and translation work. But actually the translation work is going to be just practicing parsing the participle forms together, because I really want you to memorize them and know them well before we move on to our next lesson. So I hope that you're excited about learning about participles today. If you are, grab your workbook or your piece of paper and your pen, and let's get going together. So let's begin today's lesson by answering the question, what are participles? So like infinitives, participles are also language hybrids. But whereas infinitives were verbal nouns, we could think of participles as being verbal adjectives that share characteristics of both a verb and an adjective. So as a verb, participles have tense, that is present, aorist, or perfect, as well as a voice, active, middle, or passive. And as an adjective, they will agree with the word they are modifying in three ways: in case, gender, and number. All right, so when you think of participles and what they are, think of them as being language hybrids. Specifically, they are verbal adjectives. So now that we know that participles are verbal adjectives that have characteristics of both a verb and an adjective, let us now focus specifically on these characteristics and begin with the verbal characteristics. So here's an example of a verbal characteristic. While eating, my Greek teacher gave us a test. So in this example, eating is a participle that tells us something about the verb gave. So if we look at this example, the independent clause would be my Greek teacher gave us a test, with the main verb of that clause being gave, while the first part of the sentence is the dependent clause, while eating. So what is the relationship between the participle here and the main verb? Well, we could say that the teacher gave the students a test while he was still eating, and while specifies when the action of the participle occurred. Let's now take a look at adjectival characteristics, and here's an example. The man sitting by the window is my Greek teacher. So in this example, sitting is a participle telling us something about the noun man. So the independent clause in this sentence is the man is my Greek teacher. And the dependent clause with the participle sitting is the dependent clause, where the participle is providing us more information or specifically modifying the man. So we can draw some conclusions from this. When a participle has modifiers such as a direct object or an adverb, the participle and modifiers form what is called a participial phrase. So the participial phrase in that second example would be sitting by the window. So in translation, it is important to identify the beginning and the end of the participial phrase, much like you do with a relative clause. Before we take a look at the participle forms together, I'd like to just make you aware of a few other characteristics of participles. And the first one is negation. So the negation "u" is normally used in the indicative mood, which you are aware of by now. And since the participle is not an indicative form, participles are usually negated by the particle may. So may and "u" have the same meaning, no or not. And then no personal endings. So you will notice that the participle does not use personal endings. It is not a finite verbal form, and therefore it is not limited by a subject. All right, so this characteristic is similar to the infinitive that we looked at in the previous two lessons. I'd like to begin this section by introducing you to participle morphemes. A morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning in the formation of a word. Learn to view the participle morpheme as an important indicator, much like the tense formatives that we learned. So for example, when you're dealing with the future tense, you would look for the sigma as the tense formative. When you're looking at the future passive, you would look for the tense formative, which is the theta, eta, sigma. In the first aorist, we have the sigma alpha. In the perfect tense forms, we have the kappa alpha. So in a similar way, participles have morphemes that serve as hints that help us to identify the participles and their various forms. So in this table, I've given you a summary of the participle morphemes. So when we look at the active voice, the masculine and the neuter genders will have the morphemes the nu tau, and the feminine will be characterized by us. And then for the middle passive voices, the masculine and neuter genders, as well as the feminine, as we can see there, will have the morphemes men. All right, so nu tau is used in all active forms except the perfect, and we'll take a look at the perfect forms in the next lesson. So in all active forms and in the aorist passive. So when you see a nu tau plus a case ending, you can be quite sure the word is an active participle. And then men is used in all middle passive forms. So when you see a men plus a case ending, it is probably a middle passive participle. Right, so take the time to familiarize yourself with the participle morphemes and consider them important factors in helping you to identify and recognize the various forms of participles. So because participles have adjectival characteristics and adjectives will agree with the noun that they are modifying in case, gender, and number, we see that participles are going to take various case endings. So we need to familiarize ourselves again with the different case endings. So here are the first and second declension endings. The first declension is the feminine gender. If you remember in our course, when we looked at the the first declension endings, we saw that there are three patterns: the alpha pattern, the eta pattern, and the alpha eta pattern, which is the mixed pattern. So when it comes to participles, we are going to deal with the alpha eta pattern. So let's just quickly do some revision here. So the singular endings are alpha, the genitive singular is ace, the dative is a with the iota subscript, and the alpha for the accusative. All right, and then the plural endings, we have I, own, ice, and us. And on the right hand side, we have the second declension endings, which are generally masculine in gender. So let's just go through those endings very quickly. Starting with the singular, we have os, u, o with the iota subscript and on. And then the plural endings, we have oi, own, ois, and us. All right, so these endings are very similar to the Greek articles. So if you know your Greek articles, then this shouldn't be too difficult to learn again. So now that we have done revision of the first and second declension endings, it's time now to do the third declension endings. Just a note here before we go over them is that, as we will see, the active voice generally follows the third declension ending. So that is the masculine and neuter genders, as well as the aorist passive participle. All right, so let's start with the masculine gender, the singular forms. So we have sigma, the genitive is omicron sigma, dative is the iota, and the accusative is alpha. The plural endings, we have epsilon sigma, omega nu, then we have for the dative plural sigma, iota nu, and the accusative plural alpha sigma. And then we also, if you remember, we have the neuter third declension endings. There's a neuter A and a neuter B pattern. The neuter B pattern is very rare, so we're primarily going to be dealing with the neuter A pattern. So as you can see there, for the singular endings, the nominative and accusative singulars don't have specific endings. The genitive is omicron sigma and the dative is iota. And then the plural endings, we have alpha, own, sin, and alpha. All right, so if this looks foreign to you again, please take the time just to relearn these endings, because once you have them down, it's going to make learning the various participle forms much easier for you. So I'd like to begin by teaching you the present participle of Amy. The present participle of Amy. Because I really am convinced that once you learn the Amy forms, then learning the other forms is much easier. So let's do the harder thing first, and then the rest will become easier. So let's make some observations first. So the forms of Amy look like the participle morpheme with case endings. So I've actually highlighted those participle morphemes that I showed you earlier. So you can see then the masculine and the neuter genders. You can see the morpheme, the new tau. And then when you look at the feminine gender, you can see that the new tau has changed to the us. So the active participle morpheme in the masculine and neuter is nu tau, which when joined with the connecting vowel looks like ont. Right, so we can see there that when we look at the participle forms, we can have a connecting vowel, which is an omicron. And in the feminine, the ont has been replaced by us. The forms of the present participle of Amy always have a smooth breathing mark. with an accent. And then regarding the translation, we translate them with the English participle being. Let's now look at the table and go through the forms together. So beginning with the masculine gender. So we have own, ontos, ontai, onta. The plural forms, we have ontes, ontone, usin, and ontos. So you will notice that we have the connecting vowel, the omicron, except for the nominative singular, which is simply own. Then we have the participle morpheme, the new tau, and then the case endings are the third declension endings. All right, that's why I did revision with you, so that it'll make passing these forms much easier for you. And then let's just do the neuter gender because it's very similar to the masculine. So the singular forms are on, ontos, ontai, and on. Notice that the nominative singular and the accusative singular forms are identical, and that goes for the plural as well. So the forms are onta, ontone, usin, and onta. Let's now take a look at the feminine gender, the singular forms. We have usa, usais, usei, usan. The plural forms usai, uson, usais, usas. And notice there that the feminine gender takes the first declension endings. Before we actually jump into the present participle forms, some of you might be interested in how the Greek participles are built. So let's take a look at the components of Greek participles. I've just said there, keep in mind that a participle can be built on any verb. So the present participle, for example, luantes, is built on the present stem of luo. So as you can see there, we have the stem lu, the connecting vowel omicron, the participle morpheme new tau, and then the case ending. The aorist participle, example, lusantes, is built on the aorist tense stem of luo. So we have the stem lu, then we have the tense formative for the aorist, the sigma alpha, plus the participle morpheme, plus the case ending. And in brackets there, just remember that because we're dealing with the non-indicative mood, there is no augment to indicate time. And then finally, the perfect participle, for example, lelukates, is built on the perfect tense stem of luo. So we'll actually deal with the perfect forms in the next lesson, but just to show you how they are built. So we have the reduplication, le, plus the stem lu, plus the perfect tense formative, the kappa, and then the participle morpheme in the perfect is actually omicron tau plus the case ending. All right, but don't worry too much about the perfect right now. We'll tackle that in greater length in the next lesson. All right, we want to focus now on the present and aorist participle forms. It's now time to learn the present participle forms. Before we do that, one of the keys to learning the participle forms is to memorize the 6 main forms of each participle as listed below. So that is the nominative and genitive singular forms in all 3 genders with the connecting vowel and case endings. So I've underlined them here for us. So that is the nominative and genitive cases, the singular forms for the masculine, feminine, and neuter genders. So let me just underline those for you. So if you can take the time to memorize these forms and you know the case endings, then you should be able to pass and decline the rest of the forms. Also be aware of the pattern here. The masculine and neuter genders will follow the third declension endings, and the feminine will follow the first declension endings. Also be aware of the participial morphemes, which I've highlighted, the new tau in red and the us in purple. So let's go through the forms together. Beginning with the masculine singular forms, we have luon, luontos, luontai, luonta. The plural forms, luontes, luonton, luusin, and luontas. So as you can already see, the forms are very similar to the present participle of Amy, except now we are attaching the lu stem to the front. Let's look at the neuter gender, because it's very similar to the masculine once again. So the neuter singular forms, we have luon, luontos, luontai, luon. The plural forms, luonta, luonton, luusin, and luonta. And then the feminine singular forms, we have luusa, luusais, luusei, luuson. The plural forms, luusai, luuson, luusais, luusas. Right, so those are the present active participle forms. Let us now look at the present middle forms. So right away, you'll see that the difference here is that the masculine and neuter genders will now follow the second declension endings, and then the feminine once again follows the first declension. You can also see there that the participle morpheme is now men. All right, and once again, I just want to encourage you to learn the nominative and genitive singular forms for all the genders with the connecting vowel and case endings. So let's go through those forms together, beginning with the masculine gender. We have luamenos, luamenu, luameno, luamenon. The plural forms, luamenoi, luamenon, luamenois, leamenus. The neuter gender, we have luamenon, luamenu, luameno, luamenon. The plural forms, luamena, luamenon, luamenois, and luamena. And then finally, the feminine gender forms, we have luamene, luamenes, luamene, luamenain. And the plural forms, luamenai, luamenon, luamenais, and luamenas. Let us now move on to the first aorist participle forms, starting with the first aorist active forms. So once again, because we're looking at the active voice, we see that the masculine and the neuter genders will follow the third declension endings, and the feminine once again is consistent and follows the first declension. The most significant difference between the present and the first aorist participles is that the first aorist has the tense formative, the sigma alpha. So let me just highlight that for the masculine genders for you so that you can see. Other than that, the forms are the same as the present. So let's go through them together. The masculine singular forms, we have lusas, lusantos, lusantai, lusanta. The plural forms, lusantes, lusanton, lusasin, lusantas. And then the neuter gender forms, beginning with a singular, we have lusan, lusantos, lusantai, lusan. Plural forms, lusanta, lusanton, lusasin, lusanta. And then the feminine singular forms, we have lusasa, lusasais, lusasei, lusasan. The plural forms, lusasai, lusason, lusasais, lusasas. Right, once again, I just want to encourage you, take the time to learn the nominative and genitive singular forms. All right, because once you have those down, then if you know which case endings those genders follow, then you can essentially work them out and decline them out through a process of elimination. And then moving on to the first aorist middle forms. Remember that the first aorist has independent forms for the middle and the passive. So we'll look at the middle voice first. So we see that the masculine and the neuter genders will again follow the second declension and the feminine the first declension. And then we also have the characteristic morpheme, men, which is found with the middle passive forms. So let's go through them together. The masculine singular forms, we have lusamenos, lusamenu, lusameno, lusamenon. The plural forms, lusamenoi, lusamenon, lusamenois, lusamenus. The neuter gender forms, we have lusamenon, lusamenu, lusameno, lusamenon. Plural forms, lusamena, lusamenon, lusamenois, lusamena. And then the feminine singular forms, we have lusamene, lusamenes, lusamene, lusamenain. The plural forms, lusamenai, lusamenon, lusamenes, lusamenas. Let us now take a look at the first aorist, first passive forms. Now I know that I said earlier that when we look at the middle passive voices, that we'll have the participle morpheme, the men. Right, the exception is with the first aorist, first passive. All right, we don't have the men. So what changes do we have? All right, well, we see once again that the new tau participle morpheme comes into play. It's normally found with an active voice, but here we see it in the first passive voice. We also see that the eta in the tense formative theta eta, which normally characterizes the first passive, is shortened to an epsilon. So now we have theta epsilon, the. And in the feminine gender, the new tau has been replaced by issa. All right, so I think out of all the various forms, the first aorist, first passive forms are the most unique because there are quite a few changes that take place. So it's going to look very foreign initially, but just take the time to go through them carefully. Let's do that now. Beginning with the masculine gender, the singular forms. So we have lutheis, luthentos, luthentai, luthenta. The plural forms, luthentes, luthenton, luthesin, and luthentas. And then the neuter singular forms, we have luthen, luthentos, luthentai, luthen. And the plural forms, luthenta, luthenton, luthesin, luthenta. And then the feminine singular forms, we have lutheisa, lutheseis, luthesei, lutheson. And the plural forms, luthesai, lutheson, lutheseis, luthesas. All right, so please take the time to go through those forms carefully, and especially to memorize the nominative and genitive singular forms. And then there is, of course, the second aorist participles. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the second aorist participle forms in this lesson because essentially the second aorist forms are the same as the present forms, except that we are going to have a stem change. So let's just read this together at the top. It says the second aorist active and middle participles are formed exactly like the present tense, except for the characteristic stem change. And then regarding the passives, so just be aware of the fact that when you're dealing with the first aorist passives, the first passive, there is no stem change, but it includes a theta, and it is a second passive when the theta is replaced by a phi, as is the case with this example, grapho. So there's no stem change there, but the theta is replaced by the phi instead. We covered this in a lot of detail in lesson 14. So if this sounds all foreign to you, then please take the time to refer to lesson 14 and go through these differences again by yourself. As we wrap up the present and first aorist participle forms for this lesson, I want to leave you with some helpful rules. So the following rules hold true whether the participle is present or aorist. So the first rule is this: the feminine participle always uses first declension endings. Right, so I've really emphasized that over and over again so far in this lesson. Number 2, when the masculine and neuter participles are active, they are third declension, but remember that the first aorist passive also takes third declension endings. And then the third rule: when the masculine and neuter participles are present or passive or aorist middle, they are second declension. So here is a very helpful table that I want to encourage you to memorize. So let's take a look at it together. So we can see that it has the participle morpheme. So the first one is the new tau, and that is found with the following tenses and voices, the active as well as the aorist passive. And then the case ending patterns will always be 3, 1, 3. And then the men morpheme is found with the middle or sometimes middle passive voices. And then the case ending patterns there will be 2, 1, 2. All right, so take the time to learn this table because it really is a great summary of the forms that we've learned so far.
Participles are verbal adjectives, one part verb, one part adjective. Verbal stems and declension endings are what you will learn. All active forms use third declension for neuter or masculine, and every single feminine uses first declension. Present active has a thematic vowel plus new tau for masculine and neuter, but feminine takes upsilon sigma, and dative plurals take that too. Aorist active has sigma alpha new tau for masculine and neuter. Feminines have sigma alpha sigma, and dative plurals have that too. Second aorist active are exactly the same as present active, except for the placement of the accent and a second aorist stem. For all the middles, think men, 'cause men comes right after the stem. For aorist middles it's men, and if it's a neuter or masculine, use the endings of second declension. Aorist passives have theta epsilon plus new tau for masculine and neuter, but feminines take the iota sigma, and the dative plurals take that too. Perfects have reduplication plus kappa omicron tau after the stem, but feminines take kappa upsilon iota, and this time datives don't. Participles are verbal adjectives. One part verb, one part adjective. Verbal stems and declension endings are what you have learned.
What I'd like to do in this lesson is introduce you to general principles regarding the translation of participles. So, as in the case of the infinitive, the participle also does not have personal endings, and therefore it also cannot function as an independent verb. So that's the first thing I want you to be aware of. Participles will never be the main verb of a sentence. So let's look at an example in English together. We could say, singing, the family loaded the car to go on holiday. So let's take a look at some of these words together and see how they are functioning in the sentence. Firstly, we see that in this sentence, loaded is the main verb of the independent clause. The independent clause being the family loaded the car. Then we have singing. Singing in this sentence is the participle, and it's standing within the dependent clause, a clause which cannot stand on its own and needs an independent clause to complete it. So in other words, singing here is related to the main verb loaded. It's telling us that perhaps while the family were loading the car, they were singing. So there's some temporal idea being communicated here by the participle. And then finally we have to go, which is the infinitive in the sentence. And here it's giving us the purpose for why the family loaded the car. To go on holiday. That's the reason. Right, so what I want you just to be aware of as we begin looking at the translation of participles is that a participle will never be the main verb of the independent clause. Right, it always will function in tandem or in conjunction with a main verb. So let's continue speaking about some general principles regarding the translation of participles. So in English, the participle can function in two ways. So let's use two examples to flesh this out. In the first example, we have the singing children work. And then in the second example, we have singing, comma, the children work. So in these sentences, singing is derived from the verb sing. With regard to the use of singing in the above sentences, note the following important difference. So in the first example, in the first sentence, should I say, singing has an adjectival function, i.e., it describes the noun children. So what type of children work? Well, it's the singing children who work. In the second sentence, singing has an adverbial function, i.e., the participle singing is modifying the verb work, which is the main verb of the independent clause. The emphasis here is less on the type of children who work and more on the circumstances under which the events in the main sentence took place. All right, so in the first example, there's an adjectival function, and in the second example, we have an adverbial function. So maybe in the previous slide, even though I showed you the two functions of the participle, it hasn't quite made sense to you. So let's do a short exercise here, practicing the function of the participle. So the instructions here are study the following English sentences and identify the type of participle. So let's look at the first one together. It says, it is safe to drink running water. All right, so the question is the participle running functioning adjectively or adverbially? And the answer is adjectively. So here, running is functioning like an adjective. It's telling us what type of water is safe to drink. Well, it's running water. The second example says, the students study, yawning. So is it adjectival or adverbial? And the answer is adverbial. Because once again, like we saw in the previous slide, yawning here is found within the dependent clause, and it's related to the main verb of the independent clause, which is study. And it is modifying the verb study, and the emphasis here is on the circumstances under which the students study. The third example says the gaping wound must be bandaged. All right, so is it adjectival or adverbial? And the answer is adjectival. So what type of wound must be bandaged? Well, it's the gaping wound. And in the last example, we have seeing the girl, I fell in love with her. So is this adjectival or adverbial? And the answer is adverbial. So in this sentence, the independent clause is I fell in love with her. And the dependent clause, which contains the participial phrase, is seeing the girl. So when did I fall in love with her? When I saw the girl. Right, so there's a temporal idea being communicated here by the participle seeing, and it's therefore modifying the main verb I fell. Good, so we will do lots more examples in the lessons that lie ahead, but I just want to make you aware of the two types of main functions of participles. So in summary, when the participle is used adjectively, it fulfills the same function as an adjective that is used attributively with a noun. Such a participle is usually translated with the relative clause in English, as we will see in our next lesson. And then, when the participle is used adverbially, it expresses the circumstances under which the events of the finite verb or another verb in the sentence takes place. Let's take a look at our vocabulary for lesson 26. Our first word is hamartolos, hamartolon. So as an adjective, it means sinful, and as a noun, it means sinner. Next, we have blasphemeo, blasphemeo, which means I blaspheme or I slander. Then we have diabolos, diabolon, diabolos, diabolon. As an adjective, can mean slanderous. As a noun, slanderer or devil. Next, we have didache, hey, didache, hey, which is teaching or doctrine. And then we have dioko, dioko, which is I pursue or persecute. Next, we have ate, with 3 ellipses, ate, which can be translated as if, and if, or whether, or. Right, so this is similar to ude, neither nor. And then we have idu, which is look or behold. Then we have musterion ta, which means mystery. Next we have tarasso, which means I disturb, I trouble, I stir up. And then lastly we have phobos ha, which means fear. Today we're looking at principal parts 24, 25, and 26. Specifically, we're looking at bino, which means go, balo, which means throw, and baptizo, which means baptized. So let's go through the principal parts together, starting with bino. We have bino, beisomai, ebain. There's no aorist passive principal part. The perfect active is bebeka. and then there's also no perfect middle passive form. Let's move on to balo. So we have balo, then we have balo with the contraction that's taken place there. Next we have ebalon, then we have eblethein, next bebleka, and finally beblemai. And then moving on to our last principal part for today, we have baptizo, that becomes baptizo. Then we have baptisa, baptisthein, and then we have baptika, and then finally baptismai. All right, just want to remind you again, our goal is not to memorize them, but to be able to recognize these principal parts so that the fluency of our reading will improve. For today's translation work, I'd like to do some passing practice with you, because I feel it's really important that you take the time to learn the present and the aorist participle forms before the next lesson. And the next lesson we'll take a look at the perfect, and then after that you should be able to have learned all the forms, and we can then start digging deeper into translation work together. All right, so let's just have a look at some of these examples here. So we have our first participle, do contest. The way that we go about passing participles is we give the part of speech first. So I've shorthanded the participle as PTC. Then we give the verbal characteristics first. So the tense is present, the voice is active, and then we give the adjectival characteristics. So the case is nominative, the gender is masculine, and the number is plural. And then finally we give the lexical source, the dictionary form. And this comes from dioko, which, as we've learned in our vocab today, means I pursue or I persecute. All right, so we give 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pieces of information, beginning with the verbal characteristics and then the adjectival. All right, let's quickly go through the other ones. We have ontos, so it is a present participle. Now, because this comes from Amy, excuse my handwriting, Amy, this has no voice, so I've written there none. It is an accusative, masculine plural. Then we have opheluson. Now, initially, you might think that sigma alpha is the tense formative of the first aorist, but actually it's not. So we have there the usa, which tells us that it is a feminine participle, and that nu there shows us that it is accusative. That's the ending. So we've got to look at these words carefully. So this is actually a present participle, active voice, accusative, feminine, singular, and it comes from the lexical form ophelo. Then we have accusantes, and here we have a tense formative, the sigma alpha, telling us that this is a first aorist participle, active voice, nominative, masculine, plural, from accu. And then lastly, we have pheromeno. We see the iota subscript there. It's showing us that it's a dative case. This is a present. The voice can be middle or passive. How do we know that? Well, we see the participle morpheme, the men. So the context will have to decide which is the best fit. And then we have dative, as I said. The gender can be masculine or neuter, singular, and this comes from pharaoh. Right, so there's just some guidance showing you how to go about passing participles, and we'll use this format going forward in our lessons together.